Hello everyone, welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy, the Hindu News Analysis. Today is 11th November 2025 and today we have some important topics for our discussion. And this is the list of important topics that we are going to discuss. And the first important topic with which we are going to start the session is about the Conference of Parties 30 that is going to be held in Brazil and why the Conference of Parties 30 COP30 is important for South Asian countries. And an article has been given in the Hindu newspaper, and from the syllabus point of view this is very important for General Studies paper 2, and you can also go through the syllabus as well. So let's understand the context of COP30 and why it is important for the South Asian countries. Now, first thing that we should understand is that South Asia as a region, which is home for around 2 billion people. So we all knew about this fact, and in fact the South Asia as a region has been facing environmental disasters as well in recent times. So since there is a heavy population density in most of the South Asian countries, because of any environmental disasters, there is a large scale distress and disasters that have been taking place in South Asia. And apart from that, if we talk about these environmental disasters, so there are other different types of disasters as well. They are primarily driven by the climate change and global warming. For example, monsoon floods, landslides, glacial melt, and extreme heat waves. Now, for example, take India, which is part of the South Asia. And in fact, in India itself, during summers, so we feel extreme heat waves. There are very frequent landslides in Himalayan region and also Western Ghats, and glacial lake outburst, monsoon floods, cyclones. So all these disasters are primarily fundamentally driven by the climate change and global warming. So therefore, this crisis in South Asian region, so it unfolds amid a world where multilateralism is under strain. Now, in fact, in recent times, we all knew that the multilateralism under strain. So there is a decline of WTO, decline of institutions like UN as well. So therefore, we can say that this multilateralism is under strain. Climate pledges are weakened. Trade protectionism has been rising. For example, the examples of trade protectionism is Donald Trump's America First policy, his tariff war, his trade wars. So all those things can be an examples of trade protectionism. And in fact, US withdrawal from the Paris climate deal. So this is also a backstepping from their climate commitments. So therefore, despite the fractures in the global cooperation, the fractures at the global level, it is clearly visible. The collective action remains indispensable. So there is a need for collective action from all quarters to deal with the problem of climate change, right? So therefore, there is a need for global cooperation under the aegis of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Under the UNFCCC, Conference of Parties 30 is going to be held this year in Brazil. So I hope you have understood the context. Now, it is true that there has been a shift in the global landscape. However, the South Asia's role has been expanding. Now, one thing that we should understand that South Asia as a region is home to around 2 billion people. So therefore, in this context, the South Asia's role, its influence has been expanding not only in the region of vulnerability. So they are vulnerable, there is no doubt about that. In terms of global warming, climate change, disasters, the South Asia region as a whole is vulnerable, but it is also a center of climate leadership as well. For instance, take India as an example. Now, India has been leading the global environmental leadership, the global climate leadership. So India has launched many initiatives which aimed at countering climate change and global warming. So therefore, in this context, let's understand why COP30 is important for the South Asian countries, in particular global South in general. So let's understand the climate priorities of South Asian region, right? So what is the South Asian region? Now, South Asian region comprises of all the SAARC countries or BIMSTEC countries. So those countries are being called as the South Asian countries. They including India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Pakistan, Afghanistan. So all these countries coming together, they're being called as the South Asian countries, and most of these countries are vulnerable to the climate change and global warming. So these countries are also regularly affected by the disasters which are being driven by the climate change and global warming. Now let's understand the climate priorities of the South Asian countries. Now in fact, so with respect to global climate action, now implementation is the major challenge. For example, each country is coming up with the commitments to deal with the climate change, to counter global warming. But the problem is a lack of implementation on the part of these countries. So there is a gap which has been existing in global climate governance. So whatever the commitments that each country has been making and the performance of the respective countries. And so there is a clear gap which has been existing. Right? So they are announcing their commitments, but they are doing very less to achieve those commitments. So therefore implementation is the first main challenge. Right? For example, several European Union countries have announced that they will become net zero by the year 2050. Okay, so they have announced their net zero targets, but they're not doing anything substantial which will result in achieving their net zero target or reducing their carbon emissions. So that is the main problem here. Now, in fact, whatever action that the developed countries have been promising, whatever finances that they are actually committed to provide to the developing world, least developed countries and small island developing states, so it actually failed to materialize. They're not providing finances, and they're not very good at implementation of the commitments. So therefore there is a clear failure to materialize these promises made by the Western countries. Now out of 203 initiatives which were launched since 2015, only 5% have achieved their stated goals. Now you can imagine how action is lacking. Even if they are coming up with the promises, there is a clear lack of action on the part of these countries. So if such an inaction exists, how can we ensure that these climate goals, climate objectives can be achieved in a near future? How can we counter climate change and global warming? And that's the main question here. And therefore, the failure clearly highlights the need for regional cooperation to strengthen diversity. Right, so there is a need to strengthen diversity, which is a very important, and at the same time there is also a need for the regional cooperation and the global cooperation as well. So countries should come up with commitments, not just commitments, but also a clear action plan to achieve those commitments. So there should be a cooperation at the different levels, cooperation at the regional level and also at the multilateral level. So therefore this will help us deal with, counter the climate change and global warming. Now apart from that, if you look at all the South Asian countries, most of the South Asian countries have poor governance architecture. So higher levels of poverty, lack of infrastructure, corruption, mismanagement of existing funds, lack of technology, lack of finances to build a resilient infrastructure. So these are the main problems that the South Asian countries collectively facing. Now in this context, it has been calling for robust governance and clear timelines, right? So you have announced your commitments and you also announced a timeline to achieve those commitments. Now within those timelines, you need to achieve those commitments. So therefore there is a need for a clear action plan, which is very important. And apart from that, there is a need for a robust governance architecture that has to be established by the countries in the South Asia, right? So in fact, there is a need for inclusive participation. So inclusive participation in the sense that so all the stakeholders should be brought on board. For example, the private sector, the government, NGOs, local self-governance institutions, and people at the grassroots level. So everybody should be brought on board to achieve these climate goals and climate commitments of the respective countries. However, there are platforms like Group 20 or G20, BIMSTEC, SARC, BRICS. So they can actually help serve as a regional anchors for common climate stance. Right? So these are some priorities for the South Asian countries in terms of the climate change obligations. Right? So let's understand going ahead, adaptation on par with the mitigation. Right? So for example, when you are dealing with the climate change and negative impacts of the climate change, negative consequences of the climate change, so you need to adopt and at the same time mitigate the worst effects. So when you are able to adapt to the climate change, to the global warming, you will be able to mitigate the worst consequences, the worst effect of the climate change, which is very important. So I would like to explain this with a simple example. For example, it is a very well known fact that because of the climate change, because of the increasing temperatures, so many crops would not be able to cultivate it. So crops will not be able to be cultivated if temperatures increases. For example, wheat. So wheat is a temperature sensitive crop. It may not be cultivated if temperature increases. Now replace wheat with other crops which are having a higher tolerance level to the temperatures. Now what we did, we have adapted to the changing climate, right? So if we reduce the cultivation of wheat, so it leads to what? It leads to the food security challenges. However, if we replace wheat with other crops such as pulses, cereals, so it can address both food security and the nutrition security of the people as well. Now on the one hand, we are adapting to the negative effects of the climate change, and at the same time we are also mitigating the worst consequences that we might face because of the global warming and climate change. So therefore all the South Asian countries, for both adaptation and mitigation, so they must stand shoulder to shoulder with mitigation, with emission mitigation, right? So in fact it is also said that the region may face a future where days exceeding 35 degrees Celsius, for example, in most of the South Asian countries, a day with around 35 degrees Celsius temperature or more than 35 degrees Celsius temperature, there may be more days in the future. So they would double by 2100 year, right? So this will further increases the vulnerabilities of the people, right? So as of now, we have been experiencing severe heat waves in several parts of India. But in coming years, we can expect that there will be an increasing intensity and frequency of heat waves because of the global warming and climate change. The focus should be on adaptation and mitigation, which is a very important aspect for any country. Now let's understand Nepal's glacial lake outburst floods, the coastal erosion that has been taking place in Maldives, and glacial lake outburst in India's Himalayan region, landslides in Western Ghats and Himalayas, increasing frequency and intensity of cyclones in both Bay of Bengal and Arabian Sea region, and increasing intensity and frequency of heat waves all across India and different parts of South Asia. So all these factors have been highlighting the increasing climate vulnerability of the South Asian region. So therefore adaptation mitigation is very important. Whatever climate commitments that they have announced, so those climate commitments should be achieved with a timeline. And apart from that, the South Asian countries should also secure adequate finances from the developed countries so that they can invest those finances in mitigation and adaptation, right? So this will help them reduce their climate vulnerabilities. Now, to respond effectively, countries require technical, institutional, financial support for both adaptation and mitigation of climate change. But here the problem with the South Asian countries are most of the countries are the developing countries, or the majority of the people who are living in the below poverty line as well. So therefore, in this context, it is difficult for those countries to achieve technological, institutional, or financial, a status which has been required to achieve both adaptation and mitigation. However, the developed countries need to come forward and they need to support the developing world in this front. So, it is important to rebuild trust through ambitious action. So, this is one aspect that has to be emphasized. Now, in climate action, trust plays a very, very important role. So, it will lead to the climate justice as well, right? So, when it comes to the global climate action, so there should be a multilateral cooperation, and the foundation of the multilateral cooperation should be trust, right? So however, this trust as a foundation has been eroded in recent times. It is because of the delayed finances from the developed countries to the developing countries, and diluted commitments by different countries, and the geopolitical tensions as well. For example, the Russia-Ukraine war, Israel-Palestina conflict, Israel-Hamas conflict, and diluted commitments in the sense that, for example, USA pulling out of the Paris climate deal, delayed finance from the developed countries to the developing countries. So all these factors are eroding the existing trust in the global climate cooperation between the developed and developing countries. Now climate change is a reality. All the countries should come forward and they need to act collectively to deal with, to counter climate change and global warming. So however, the developed nations, are actually responsible for the present level of climate change or global warming. However, they are off track to meet their 2030 NDCs. So NDCs are nationally determined contributions that each country announces that by the year 2030 they would reduce the emissions, and they would also reduce the emission intensity of the GDP. They would also do other activities like afforestation and providing technology, providing finances to the developing countries. But here the problem is that most of these developed countries are off track to meet their 2030 nationally determined contribution targets. So therefore, it has been weakening their collective faith in the collective processes. It has been weakening the trust between the developed and developing countries with respect to the climate action. However, fulfilling existing pledges, it is aligning with new climate commitments, because the Paris climate deal, it aimed to reduce the increased global temperatures to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial levels. So that is the target of the Paris climate agreement, right? So therefore, in order to achieve this, there is a need for a renewed climate commitments from the most of the countries, mostly the developed countries, right? So without the genuine delivery, every unkept promise that has been made by different countries, it widens the existing gap between developed and developing countries, and it will further undermines the multilateralism itself, right? So therefore, this trust is very important when it comes to the climate action. So let's understand the climate finance from promises to predictability as well, because as I've already told you that as of now, the developing world and underdeveloped countries or small island developing states, they don't have the finances. They are excessively dependent on the developed countries for finances and technology transfer. Now, in fact, for South Asia, finance is considered as a lifeblood of action, because most of these countries are underdeveloped. They lack infrastructure, they lack technology, they lack finances. So therefore, we can say that finances for South Asia is the lifeline, because effective climate finance must be predictable, adequate, and fairly distributed among all the stakeholders. It should be easily accessible, and it should not come with any conditionalities, right? So it should be a non-debt inducing. Imagine that US has provided a $5 billion for countries in South Asia, and US asked those countries to pay this $5 billion in future date with interest rate. So therefore, it should not be like that. The climate finance should be easily accessible, it should be fairly distributed. For example, you have discussed that South Asia has 2 billion population, so different countries have different population. So therefore, it should be fairly distributed on the basis of population, on the basis of vulnerability of those respective countries. And apart from that, it should be predictable and adequate as well. So however, the vague targets such as a 300 billion adaptation goal by 2035. So this is a vague target. So don't have any assessment, don't have any scientific study properly to understand how much money is required for adaptation and mitigation, building resilient infrastructure, countering climate change and global warming. So it is meaningless having such a vague estimate of the loss and damage or adaptation. So therefore, there is a need for a clear pathways outlining who delivers how much, when they should deliver, and with how much, how to ensure the accountability and transparency of that money. So everything needs to be, there should be a proper framework. That's very important. So however, the proposed Baku to Belem roadmap to 1.3 trillion, so it must be grounded in operational clarity, right? So this is what is operational clarity, right? So how much is being contributed by each country, when they will contribute, how they will contribute, how it will be spent, how it will be distributed among the countries, how equity can be achieved. So all these things have to be clearly mentioned. However, South Asia's least developed countries, so they are calling for tripling of adaptation finance and dedicated regional allocations as well. Because if they don't have adequate finances, it is very difficult for the South Asian countries to adapt to mitigate the negative effects, the negative consequences of the climate change. And that's why they're calling for tripling adaptation finance and dedicated regional allocation from funds such as Green Climate Fund, Loss and Damage Fund, and Adaptation Fund as well. So these are the 5 pledges that Prime Minister Narendra Modi made during his Glasgow meeting. Right, so you can also go through these 5 promises that India would like to achieve in near future. So I hope you have understood this. And the very next important topic is Prime Minister of India Narendra Modi's trip to Bhutan. So in this context, let's discuss India-Bhutan relations. And this article has been given in the Hindu newspaper from the syllabus point of view. This is very important for General Studies paper 2 as well. So let's understand the context briefly before going into this topic. Now, in fact, Bhutan's former king, Jigme Sangye Wangchuk. So he's also known as K4. So father of the current monarch, Jigme Kesar Namgyal Wangchuk K5. So he turns 70 on November 11, 2025. Now, in fact, he is actually revered as Bodhisattva king. He even ruled from the age of 17 until his abdication in 2006. So he actually guided Bhutan into a modernity with wisdom and integrity as well. So therefore, celebrating the birthday, celebrating his milestone birthday being held in Thimphu. Right. So with Prime Minister Narendra Modi attending to honor Bhutan's deeply respected former ruler. However, so this particular article, it highlights the 70th birth celebration of Bhutan's former king Jigme Sangye Wangchuk K4. And so how this event will reflect the deep-rooted relations, friendly relations between India and Bhutan. Now also understand that Bhutan don't have the formal diplomatic relations with China. So Bhutan is a protectorate of India. So India has been providing security to Bhutan, right? So India is providing defense of Bhutan. So therefore, in this context, it is very, very important. And in fact, when the Belt and Road Initiative has been launched by China, all of India's neighboring countries are part of the Belt and Road Initiative except Bhutan. Bhutan is not part of the Belt and Road Initiative, along with India also, because they have concerns with respect to China's expansionist policy, China's territorial assertiveness and aggression. So therefore, it explores the historic leadership of a K4, the strengthening of the bilateral relations under PM Modi's Neighbor First policy. Remember that Prime Minister Narendra Modi launched the Neighborhood First policy to strengthen India's relations with all of its neighbors and extended neighborhood. So, under India's Neighborhood First policy, Bhutan is a very important place, right? So, therefore, if you look at India and Bhutan relationship, there are several areas which can be considered as a cornerstone of the relations. For example, the hydropower cooperation, tourism, security, sustainable development, infrastructure development, people to people ties, connectivity, right? So all these things are the major areas, the major pillars of cooperation between India and Bhutan, right? So let's understand India Bhutan relations. Now, in fact, if you define India Bhutan relations, so they are being strengthened, they bonded together by trust and a common vision, right? So we have understood why Prime Minister Narendra Modi paid an official visit to Bhutan, right? So Modi, who made Bhutan his first foreign visit when he became Prime Minister in the year 2014, continues to prioritize this partnership under India's Neighborhood First policy. So India still prioritizes Bhutan's interests, Bhutan's concerns under India's Neighborhood First policy. During his reign, King Jingme Sangye Wangchuk K4 strengthened Bhutan's ties with India, recognizing India as a trusted partner and a protector of Bhutan's sovereignty. Remember, I've told you that India has been providing defense and security to Bhutan. And apart from that, he even invited India's Border Roads Organization BRO to build country's road network and pioneered the idea of hydropower generation for export to India. So therefore, creating a sustainable source of national income for Bhutan and further deepening or strengthening the bilateral cooperation between India and Bhutan as well. Now, in fact, hydropower is the cornerstone of India and Bhutan relations, because so hydropower cooperation has long been a key pillar. So Bhutan has an unlimited potential for hydropower generation, and at the same time in India also the demand for power has been increasing over the years. So therefore India has been collaborating with Bhutan to tap the hydropower potential, and India has been building the infrastructure for the generation of hydropower and Bhutan selling the hydropower to India, so that it is mutually benefiting both India and Bhutan. So therefore it has been symbolizing mutual trust, mutual benefit and economic interdependence of India and Bhutan. So however, during Prime Minister Narendra Modi's current visit to Bhutan, he and King K5, so they will inaugurate 1020 megawatt Punat Sangchu 2 hydroelectric project. So this is another very important hydroelectric project where 1020 megawatt hydroelectricity will be generated from this project, and it will benefit both Bhutan and India as well. Now, in fact, this hydropower project has already started generating hydropower, and it will further boost India's economy, and it will also provide power to India as well. Now, however, this hydroelectricity project is funded by India, and this project's costs are repaid through electricity sales to India. Right? Whatever hydropower which has been generated through this hydroelectric project, so this hydroelectric power will be sold to India by Bhutan. Right? So India has actually constructed this project. Right? So therefore, the government to government model has been successful. The future projects should also involve private sector in both India and Bhutan as well. For example, Indian companies like Tata Power, Adani Power, so they are ready to collaborate with the Bhutanese firms as well. However, so if you look India-Bhutan relationship, beyond hydropower, there are other areas also which are a very important pillars of India-Bhutan relationship, right? For example, infrastructure development, connectivity, education, community projects, heritage restoration, reinforcing the enduring partnership which is grounded in the progress and shared prosperity of both India and Bhutan, right? So I hope you have understood the context and the article as well. So let's discuss the next very important topic, which is about the rural unemployment has been coming down, but there has been an increase in the urban unemployment rate. So this has been revealed by the periodic labor force participation survey. So from the syllabus point of view, this is very important for General Studies paper 3, and you can also go through the syllabus of UPSC as well. Now, what is the context? Let's understand the context of this article. The context is the periodic labor force participation survey for July and September 2025. It has come up with the unemployment data in India. So it has revealed that rural unemployment among persons who are aged 15 years and above has declined to 4.4%. However, if you look at the urban unemployment, it has marginally increased for this period. So therefore, it has been highlighting that the existing employment trends in both urban areas and rural areas, and the sectoral workforce distribution all across India as well, right? So it clearly says that the unemployment rates marginally declined in rural areas and unemployment rates have increased marginally in the urban areas, right? So this is the context of the topic, and let's understand the periodic labor force participation survey. So this periodic labor force participation survey is launched by the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation under the National Statistical Office, NSO. So labor force participation survey is released by National Statistical Office, which is under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. Now, in fact, it has started in the year 2017 April to provide quarterly urban and annual rural employment indicators. However, if you look at the objectives of periodic labor force participation survey, so it estimates employment, unemployment, labor force participation, sectoral participation of workforce, so all across India, both in urban areas and rural areas. So however, if we talk about the methodology that the periodic labor force survey follows, it uses a rotational panel sampling design for continuous data collection on households and individuals who are aged 15 years and above, right? So this is the methodology that they actually use. However, if you look at the significance of the periodic labor force participation survey, it provides us so in-depth analysis and insights about India's labor market health, and it will also help us guiding policy interventions like PM Kaushal Vikas Yojana, which is a skill development program, employment guarantee scheme, Mahatma Gandhi National Employment Rural Employment Guarantee Act. So therefore, for all these schemes, it provides important insight. It provides policy interventions, right? So therefore, these insights increasingly important as the country navigates the challenges of reducing. So therefore, if we wanted to reduce unemployment, if we wanted to provide a livelihood support for every section, and if we wanted to alleviate poverty, so the data which is provided by the periodic labor force participation survey is very important, because with the help of this data, important interventions can be made by the government to provide adequate means of livelihood to every section. So that's all for today, and thank you so much. So please subscribe our YouTube channel and like the video. Thank you.